So, hello everyone, welcome to our webinar this evening. My name is Victoria and I am one of the 3 African representatives on the IUBMB Trainee Initiative Leadership Committee. And we're really excited to welcome you to the second webinar of the year. And we have 2 really exciting talks on the role of research in science policy and the relationship between researchers and decision makers. But before we get into that, I just wanted to mention a few things. So if you haven't already joined our mailing list, you can do so here by scanning the QR code on the screen. And if you're not already following us on Twitter and Instagram, please do so. We'd love to have you. And this is our handle on screen here for both Twitter and Instagram. We'd also love to have feedback from you. So feel free to email us if you have got feedback or if you've got any questions. Please drop us an email. We'd love to hear from you. So tonight's webinar is going to be recorded and we'll be posting the recording onto our website in a few days after the event. So if you can't stay for the whole thing, or if you know somebody who isn't able to join us this evening, they can still benefit from the webinar, from the recording of the webinar on the website. So another thing is that we will be having a question and answer session after each talk. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we, the moderators, will read them out to the speakers. You can also upvote other people's questions if you like them or agree with them and want the same question answered. And we'll try and read out the most upvoted questions first and hopefully be able to get through everything. All right. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Tatenda, who's going to introduce our first speaker of the evening.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Just checking if you can hear me well.
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Awesome. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So great to have you here. Thank you all for joining us. Just going to do a short introduction of our first speaker, Dr. Heidi Hackman. She is the Director of Future Africa at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. She holds an MPhil in Contemporary Social Theory from the University of Cambridge in the UK and a PhD in Science and Technology Studies from the University of Twente in Netherlands. Dr. Hackman's career includes more than 20 years of international experience in science and technology policy, global science strategy and systems development, and international science advice and diplomacy. Before joining the University of Pretoria, she served as the founding CEO of the International Science Council in Paris and as executive director of the Council's 2 predecessor organizations, the International Council for Science and the International Social Science Council. Welcome, Dr. Heidi Hackman. We're very excited to hear your talk.
Thank you so much, Tatenda, and I'm grateful for the invitation. It's nice to be reconnected with a member of the International Science Council, which IUBMB is. So thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see that?
Yes, perfect. We can see you, Heidi. See your screen at least.
So perhaps just to say, Victoria or Tatenda, please just feel free to interrupt me when I'm going over time. I hope I won't, but please do interrupt me. And I also want to warn you that I am at home and I have a little dog. So if there's barking, don't get a fright.
No problem.
What I thought I would do, and keep it very informal, actually, what I enjoyed about thinking about what I want to say tonight is that I thought about the issue of the impact of research in the light of my own career as a science policymaker. And I just want to share with you some of the reflections that have come from that, and hope that that stimulates some interest and debate with you. So just on the left there, what you see is the organizations that I have worked for. And really my roles have always been in one way or another about science policy. And if I think back retrospectively of those 20 plus years, it really has been a career around finding ways of ensuring that research and scholarship makes a difference to society. It's about impact. We didn't talk about it necessarily back in 1989 as impact. That's a more recent narrative, I think. It was about relevance, it was about social benefit, and then some of the other terms that you see in this diagram kind of reflect that the narrative about impact has gone in different directions, but it's always been there. We've always had, in one way or another, to show what difference research and scholarship, what different science, and when I say science, I mean all the sciences, natural, social, human, engineering, etc. It's always been about having to demonstrate in one way or another what difference we make to society, to societal challenges. And that's the role of science policymaker in one way or another. And I hope to share some of the reflections on that. In that same time, I think we have witnessed some key trends, and I've just summarized them very briefly here. First of all, the demand from society for science to be relevant, to have impact, to make a difference, has grown in this time. And it has grown with increasing urgency. And that's a reflection of the nature of the problems that we are expected to make a difference to. And in that regard, in terms of what is the target of our impact, what we've seen in this time is obviously a growing emphasis on global challenges that require global responses. And I'll come back to that in a moment, but we've seen in the last decade, the emergence of global frameworks around which the world can rally, and the world of science indeed does rally. The other and final, I think, key trend is that we used to talk a lot about solutions, but now the talk is about transformations. And I think it's important just to recognize that transformations, or introducing the notion of transformations, raises two issues. One is that a lot of our work on impact and on relevance or influence of science has been targeted at the policy community. So I'm sure you've all written policy briefs, and we all know the days of you do your research and then you have a workshop with policymakers. But the nature of the problems that we're dealing with today and that we're asked to address, and the call for societal transformation, means that we need to impact not only policy, but public action. And of course, that's obvious because policy doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in the context of a broader public. So I think those are important shifts or trends in what I would call the story of impact in the last 20 plus years. So what are those global challenges and global frameworks? None of this is new to you, but it is important, I think, for us to recognize that these, we had the Millennium Development Goals, but now we have lots of global agendas, the so-called UN's post-2015 agendas. And these are, unlike the Millennium Development Goals, these are important in the sense that they are intended, and indeed they do speak to all countries. So there are truly global frameworks. And of course, the Sustainable Development Goals, or the 2030 Agenda, is the one that certainly at the University of Pretoria, is a framework also for reporting on our research, for looking at what our research agendas entail. It's a rallying point for our scientific community. And I think that's true for many scientific communities, be it at universities or in other scientific organizations. But alongside the SDGs, there's the Paris Climate Agreement, there's the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the New Urban Agenda, the Human Development Index, And since I put together this slide probably about a year ago, I've been using this slide for a year, there are other emerging global frameworks, and I will mention a few of them as we go along. Of course, we know that just before COVID, the UN published a very important, its first UN Global Sustainability Report. And from that, again, the emphasis on transformation was very clear. But also from that report, we realized, and it was a kind of rallying cry again, that we're not doing enough. We're not doing well enough on implementation of the SDGs. And at that point, the UN launched what they call a decade of action. This was towards the end of 2019, and really refocusing the efforts of societal sectors, private sector. I mean, the call is on not just on science, but on everyone to rally around implementing the SDGs. And the Global Sustainable Development Report made a very strong argument for the mandate for science to do that. And then COVID hit. And with COVID, I think it was a time where the UN was then able to talk about a recommitment to the 2030 agenda, with the UN Secretary General also publishing his milestone report called Our Common Future, that called for that recommitment and really put a very strong emphasis again on the role of the scientific community in producing integrated, actionable knowledge, solutions-oriented knowledge, working at a systems level and understanding, and also contributing to the development of visions and narratives around emerging challenges. I think COVID was so unexpected in many ways that we realized the SDG framework with the 7 Sustainable Development Goals was quite a fixed framework and had not taken into account the possible emergence of new challenges and of cascading systemic risks, as we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic. The sad reality is that at this point in time, and this has been written about a lot, but suffice it to say, at this point in time, we kind of acknowledge that we're not making progress. We're not making headway in meeting the SDGs and many of the other global frameworks. And so, you know, we can talk about that at length, and that's not the point of tonight. But for me, what it means is that this pursuit of impact of research is actually a really, really difficult thing. It becomes more and more complicated because you think, well, we have these global frameworks that the UN, the multilateral system, supports. It's relevant to all countries. It was informed critically by the scientific community globally. It is about collaboration between science and society, and yet we are not delivering on those goals. So what do we do about increased impact? What makes it equally difficult is that if you look at the global context for science currently, there are some real obstacles to the pursuit of impact. And the first one is through information and communications technology, through the social media, through now, you know, AI, ChatGPT, etc., and all those developments. These are all challenges to the value of scientific inquiry and understanding. We have access to information which in ways that are absolutely unprecedented in our lifetimes. And what the UN calls the information pandemic, so misinformation, disinformation, is a really challenging phenomenon for understanding the value of scientific inquiry, the need for scientific interpretation, and therefore it's an impediment to the impact of research and scholarship. And the other one is the challenges that we see to global scientific exchange, to the idea of benefit sharing in collaborative relationships, in a world that is now marked, obviously, with really rapidly developing new geopolitical order, and resurgent nationalism, also resurgent nationalism in the science sector, where we're talking about issues like research security. And these are not conducive to the kind of collaboration that in some ways we saw during COVID, and that led to the vaccine, for example. So we'll come back to the policy paradigm that this is a particular impediment to. But just again, to make the point that it's kind of depressing when you've had a long career in trying to ensure that science makes a difference, and you realize that on the big issues of the day, sustainable development, climate change, we're not making great progress, and we're facing a context in which pursuing impact through the public valuing of science is a really, really challenging and complex field of work. In this 20-year period, the other thing that has shifted dramatically, and this is a rather simplified way of showing it, is that our understanding of the notion of impact and how it is achieved has shifted from essentially a linear process to an iterative process. It was, and with that you see shifts like in the 1990s, we were still talking about differences between fundamental or basic science research and applied science, with the applied science being the domain where you achieve impact, where you provide solutions to societal problems. Very linear process. The reference to policy briefs is very similar. Researchers do their work, they come up with their results, and then they feed those results to policymakers in one way or another, whether it's a brief or a workshop or a report. So a very linear process. And with that, the understanding of the relationship between science and society was very much one about science for the benefit of society. That has shifted dramatically over the last 20 years to, as I said, a much more iterative process where impact is understood as influence, an impression or a footprint, and that the relationship is about science working with society. And it's interesting, if I think about the organizations that I've run, like the International Council for Science and then eventually the International Science Council, if you look at the vision statements of those, they actually shifted. The International Council for Science, the vision used to be science for the benefit of society. Then it was science in society. And the most recent version of it was science with society. And the International Science Council's vision now is science as a global public good, which really is much more inclusive, much more comprehensive. But it's about this relationship. It's about recognizing that these are not sectors that can be siloed, and that if we do want research and scholarship to have impact, then science does need to work with societal actors from all spheres, from all sectors, not just policy, civil society, the media, communities, activist groupings, etc. So that's been a key shift in our understanding. And I think those shifts and the trends that I outlined from, talking about relevance to transformative science, those are all reflected in the world of science policy making. Our science policies have shifted in similar ways. The paradigm today, the policy paradigm that is now kind of comprehensive in the sense that the science policy paradigm, in the sense that it is about advancing the relevance, but also the rigor and responsibility of science towards society, is the global open science movement. This has been probably in the making for around, I would say, 12, 15 years. And what is really significant is that in 2021, UNESCO, which is one of the largest UN agencies, all 194 member states of UNESCO adopted a resolution, a recommendation on open science. And what open science covers are policies that determine access to the record of scientific knowledge. So that's about open access publishing primarily, but it's access to, for society to, and you know, it's also within the science community that we all have equal access to the public record of science. It's very much about the digital revolution and about big data, data mining, and the interoperability of data. So the openness of data is not only about access, but it's about ensuring that data from different scientific domains and disciplines is interoperable, is accessible. So it's about open data. And crucially, the open science paradigm also includes policies and practice regimes around openness to society. And this touches on that element of the relationship between science and society, the notion of engaged science, or what many of us refer to as transdisciplinary science, science that works with societal actors, where we talk about bringing in societal actors, relevant societal actors into the framing of our research agendas, into the design or the identification of research problems, and then the co-creation of the knowledge that is intended to be actionable, solutions-oriented, and transformative. So I think it's really important for anybody who is interested in science policy to dig into the open science paradigm. It's inclusive, it covers most of science policy today. So all of this open science, and which covers policies around science communications, it covers policies around engaged science, transdisciplinary science, it covers policies around internationalization, international collaboration of science. All of these are about what I call pushing that science for transformations envelope. Where I think science policy as a system, as a field of work, has neglected or failed to pay enough attention is to the fact that science itself doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in a system. It happens in a political system. It happens in the context of policies. It happens in the context of institutions. And funding regimes, critically, funding regimes. And those science systems, the ecosystem in which we practice, those need to be transformed as well in order to enable science for transformations. And I think that's where the work for science policymakers now lies. So what kind of issues need to be addressed and are being addressed, to be fair, but a lot of work to be done in order to ensure that, we're asking scientists to practice in new ways, to adopt new approaches that are time-consuming, like transdisciplinarity, like working with society. This is not how scientists used to operate. So we're asking scientists to change their methods, their approaches, their orientations. But our science systems don't always enable or reward that. So just a taste of what transforming science systems and providing those critical enablers of transformative science entails. It's about fostering attitudes of collaboration rather than competition. Also in funding regimes, we see a lot of funders, particularly when I think about international support, funding support in Africa, a lot of the funders, they set the agendas. Those agendas are not coordinated amongst themselves. And as a result, scientific communities in Africa end up competing with each other for funding on agendas that are set outside of the continent. So that's not enabling the kind of open collaboration between countries, between scientific disciplines that we feel is necessary in order to promote and support transformative science. Another issue would be about the inclusivity and diversity of the scientific enterprise, about the role of women in science, about issues of racism and discrimination in science. Much more attention needs to be paid to ensuring that there is true equity. And a lot of emphasis has been paid in the past about the freedom of science, but this is also about the responsibility of science as an enterprise. Another issue would be the global knowledge divides that have always been around and that are very persistent. Capacities, resources for science systems development and growth are very varied. So if you look at science at a global level, it's not an equal playing field. You know, this issue of the things we ask scientists to do and the attitudes we ask them and approaches we ask them to adopt, we need to ensure that the way in which research is evaluated, assessed, and rewarded are in line and support those changes. And that's not the case. We know that when you're building your scientific career, you are pursuing the publish or perish track. You are assessed on outputs that are not necessarily aligned with the kind of policies around transdisciplinarity, engagement, openness, etc. And when it comes to global collaboration, and this really does link back to the notion of global knowledge divides, we know that collaboration that there isn't equity, that partnerships between the global north and global south remain skewed, that agendas still tend to be set in the global north, and that when we try to speak as a global scientific community, the voices of scientists, researchers in the global south are often not heard. So these are just examples of the kind of science systems transformations that policymakers are working on, need to work much harder on, in order to ensure that the approaches we adopt today to pursue impact are actually enabled. So that takes me to my current job. I've been at Future Africa now for a year, and I just want to very briefly tell you what Future Africa is, what it's for, and then tell you how we or what our approach to impact is. And it ties up very much with many of the things I've said. So Future Africa is a Pan-African platform. It's hosted at the University of Pretoria, but it's a Pan-African platform for open collaborative research that contributes concrete solutions to urgent and complex real-world problems, and that informs and supports processes of profound social change, transformation, in other words, profound social change towards just and sustainable futures. It's a bit of a mouthful, but we talk about both solutions and transformations, because of course it might sound bizarre to say, but not all solutions are transformative. So we want both. We do this in Africa, for Africa, but we also work in ways that try to inspire the rest of the world. And in fact, as a Pan-African collaborative platform, we embed, first of all, African collaboration in a global context. So we have many, many international partners in the work that we do. And we work on challenge domains that reflect the SDGs and other emerging global paradigms like sustainable food systems. We've got a big program of work on One Health, planetary health, transformations to sustainability, youth unemployment and empowerment, global equity in Africa, and what we call African science futures. So we also have this science policy angle to our work. What is that? This is, as I said, this is quite a mouthful. What does that mean in practice? It simply means Future Africa is supposed to pursue impact. My mandate is to put in place strategies, activities that increase the impact of research done in and for Africa. And our approach to impact is to advance what we call transformative research. Future Africa, in the university itself, in its strategy, we are called a transdisciplinary platform. And transdisciplinary research is indeed a keystone of what we do, but we embed it in this broader notion of transformative research. And I just want to go through briefly with you what we mean by that. So we define it, transformative research, as research that in the first place is collaborative, and one I should add in that first line, purposeful. So it's aimed at solving a problem and collaborative. And then it has these characteristics. In the first place, it produces integrative knowledge by being truly interdisciplinary. I think, interdisciplinarity and policies around interdisciplinarity were high on the agenda 20 years ago. Today, we automatically have or assume that if we talk about transdisciplinarity, we're covering interdisciplinarity, but that's actually not the case. And we mustn't forget the importance of interdisciplinarity, that drawing on knowledge, methods, and approaches across relevant fields and disciplines of science. And I say relevant as in depending on what the problem we're addressing might be, is absolutely fundamental to transformative research. And to be honest, I cannot think of one of those global challenges that does not require, for example, strong engagement from the social and human sciences. So integrative knowledge, then engagement. And this is where the working with stakeholders from policy, private sector, etc., in co-creating knowledge and solutions-oriented knowledge is key, transdisciplinarity. And it's really about, when you say working with stakeholders, it is not about them being part of a project as providers of data or witnesses. It is about understanding that they hold valid knowledge. So transdisciplinarity in itself is a complex issue because it challenges us to think about different knowledge systems. A lot of you would have heard about the importance of including indigenous knowledge. But indigenous knowledge, religious knowledge, the knowledge of practitioners, all of this needs to be brought in meaningful and appropriate ways in the co-design and co-production of so-called solutions or actionable knowledge, whatever language you want to use. Engagement. Transformative research is also more likely if we look at the problems from a systems perspective. That might seem very obvious to say, but a lot of people forget that the complexity of the global challenges that we are asked to address is about the systemic nature of those problems, making sense of that complexity. And so systems analysis, again, which has been around for many, many years, is now really becoming central to our efforts. Second to last, digitally enabled knowledge. We are going through a digital revolution, which has enormous, enormous impacts on science. And we believe that we need to understand what the benefits are of digital technologies for fueling scientific discovery. So it's not just about using ICT to access, it's also about that. It is about reaching the widest possible number of stakeholders. It is about sharing data, but we also need to understand that things like big data, data mining, AI, fuel scientific discovery in ways that we have not had before. They allow us to deal with complexity in ways that are novel. And so our work needs to be digitally enabled. And finally, Future Africa has, and we've actually set up a futures literacy incubator. We need to realize that transformative research is about a better future, a transformed future. And very often we bring together stakeholders in these engaged, co-created research projects, and we fail to begin that process by understanding whether, in fact, we all have a common vision of the future that we are pursuing. And futures literacy is a new and very powerful tool, particularly the futures literacy laboratories, to expose our assumptions about those futures, and to create an initial and very equitable playing field for multiple stakeholders to engage, because none of us own the future. So futures literacy, could talk a lot more about that. That's our approach to transformative research. And we try in all the research that we advance, that we support, to make sure, and it's a tough job, but that we tick these 5 boxes. I should, of course, say that science communication is embedded throughout of this. So, you know, when it comes to engagement, when it comes to futures thinking, all of this, it is very much also about science communications. Last slide. In addition to pursuing that transformative research approach, we do actually focus very much on defragmenting the landscape. So we really look at, not like a lot of universities have many bilateral project relationships. We go for making sure that within the science sector, it's not just about collaboration between disciplines, but it's collaboration between types of institutions. So the higher education institutions with academies, with other types of science organizations, and then it's collaboration between those national science systems across borders, of course. So we convene across actors in the broader science system. And we connect also with the work of science diplomacy and science advice, which is sort of sits alongside the science policy community. They don't always interact enough, I think. So there is, you know, the new Science Diplomacy Capital for Africa, for example. There is an international network of government science advisors. That has a particular chapter in Africa. And so we really try also to bring the research, transformative research practices in line with, or to at least connect with and look for synergies between what the science diplomats and the science advisors are doing. And finally, given the importance that, you know, I've placed on having to transform our science systems to enable transformative science, we also have a new initiative that is focused on ensuring that, particularly in Africa, we are developing the next generation of leaders of science systems. We often assume that a good scientist will be a good head of a funding agency or a good vice chancellor. That's not always the case. And so there is also a focus in our work on science systems leadership. Tatenda, I'm going to leave it at that. I hope I didn't go over time too badly. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. for talking. Very refreshing to see how science policy navigates of science systems, and also looking at how, you know, the transformation of those systems can lead to a ripple effect of, you know, transformative growth and development both in Africa and globally. So I'm just going to go into some of the questions that were raised up. One question that has been asked was, are there different strategies for communicating to policy the public?
Tatenda, I'm losing the connection. I don't know whether the problem is on my side or your side. Are others hearing Tatenda?
Okay, can you hear me clearly now?
It's a bit broken
Hello?
up. I don't know whether I'm the only one experiencing that problem.
It is a little bit broken, Tatenda. Heidi, I have a question here. I'm not sure it'd be easy if I just answer quickly. The one was, are there different strategies for communicating to policymakers compared to the public?
I think it's a fantastic question. And I think I would venture a guess to say that current science communications work focuses on communicating with policymakers, less so with communities, with private sector. I mean, our relationship between science and the private sector needs so much work. So I would say there should be different strategies, but they should be done in an integrated way. So I'm not a science communications expert, but I do think that our focus, as I said in the beginning, has been very much about how do we communicate the result to policymakers who are magically going to implement, without thinking that policy does not happen in a vacuum, and the context and how you influence public action is critical. So I would say there have to be different strategies, and possibly there aren't at the moment.
All right, thank you so much. I hope I'm much clearer now. I
can hear you better now, Tatenda. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for answering that question. We have another question from an anonymous attendee that says, do platforms like ChatGPT undermine the value of research, or do they open up a way for public engagement or understanding?
Wow, so we need webinars on this. I mean, this is the big discussion now, you know. I think the fear is that ChatGPT could fuel the phenomenon of mis and disinformation, and that if it is not used critically, that does undermine, can undermine the value of scientific knowledge. I have used it recently, experimented with it, and I find it remarkably powerful. But, you know, I realized that if I use ChatGPT to ask questions in fields or on issues that I feel I have expertise on, then I can judge the responses. If I'm asking about things I know nothing about or know little about, I don't know whether what I'm being told is correct or incorrect. So I think there are big issues there about regulation and looking at not just the ethics and of AI, but also looking at what this means for the public valuing of scientific knowledge. I do think that's an issue.
Definitely. Thank you for that. I think it definitely makes it easier to be able to have an objective judgment of what's happening, especially if you have expertise, but it can be quite damaging for people who have no other knowledge or who have lay knowledge about the types of questions that they're asking. Just kind of driving off on that question, this question asks the relationship between is asking about the relationship between citizen science and open science, and how committed should researchers be to increasing public engagement activities for the benefit of society?
Okay, so on the commitment side, I mean, I think we must just be realistic and, you know, understand that not everybody goes to university and wants to pursue an academic career in order to have direct impact. I think that's unrealistic. As a system, we're pushing towards impact and we want this commitment to engagement, but it's not for everybody. And that's also to say, you know, to make the point that in open science and in engaged science, there should be a role for those scientists who are doing basic fundamental work. It's not that dichotomy between basic and applied science is actually obsolete when you think about open science. There should be, depending on what the problem is you're addressing, obviously, there is a role for fundamental curiosity-driven research, but it's about how we use that existing knowledge in engaging with other knowledge systems and other knowledge partners. So I think the commitment at a systems level is important. And that doesn't mean everybody's going to be equally good at engagement. Engagement is also about a skill. And that's why we're developing training programs on transdisciplinarity, etc. It's about soft skills as well. Citizen science is an interesting one. So a lot of people in the policy, in science policy, and a lot of people in research systems equate citizen science with open science or with transdisciplinary science. Citizen science has a much longer history and it is growing. What I think is fundamental to understand is that citizen science that's been around for decades is about citizens providing data that proper scientists then interpret and analyze and publish about. So they're engaged, but they are not co-creating knowledge. The kind of citizen science that we're seeing today is much more about understanding not just citizens as providers of data, but also that they have knowledge that can help interpret and co-create actionable knowledge, which is, you know, in relation with scientific knowledge. I hope that makes sense.
No, it definitely does. It actually reminds me of a webinar we had, I think, last year. We were looking at Foldit, which was a citizen science program in which people are able to use protein folding. And pretty much everyone sees it as a game, but then it actually helps people be able to see the best kind of conformations of proteins that can be made for drug discovery and the like. So definitely, I do believe that it has changed over the years, and it's about being open, or rather being kind of, really open to seeing how it can transform and how we can move with that transformation. I think that's the last question we can take for now. Hopefully at the end, if there are more questions that we can take, that will be great. But thank you so much, Dr. Heidi Hackman, for being with us today and just sharing a lot with us. I think it's really helped us open up our mind, especially to the beauty of leadership and how leadership can be instilled in a lot of our scientists and our researchers, and how that can lead to much more development at a large scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatenda. Thank you.
I think now just leave the floor to Oswald, who will be introducing our next speaker. Hi, Oswald. Sorry, I don't think we can hear you right now.
Oswald, are you present on here? We can't see your cam or hear you.
Hello.
Oh, there you go. There you are. Great.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. You can go ahead and introduce Lizette.
Okay, thank you. So thanks, Victoria. So our next speaker this evening is Prof. Lizette Kokemer. Prof. Lizette is a researcher at the University of Witwatersrand. She built her career in malaria mosquito control and has a research interest in molecular systematics, insecticide resistance, vector biology, and the development of novel vector control tools or interventions such as entomopathogenic fungi and the sterile insect techniques. So today she has published over 100 scientific papers, and she is a fellow of Royal Entomological Society, an elected member of the Academy of Science of South Africa, a regional and technical advisor for sustainable vector control solutions. So Prof. Lizette, one more time, welcome, and thank you for joining us. It is always a pleasure to be around such an outstanding researcher that inspires us. So As most of us coming from academics, we obviously observe that a large number of laboratory studies provide important and relevant knowledge, but few of these are used for the policy or operational implementation. So this evening, Lizette's talk will discuss some work she has been involved in, where students, researchers, malaria control managers, and policy stakeholders are all contributed as a team to significantly reduce malaria transmission. So, Professor Lisette, you have the floor.
Thanks, Oswald. I hope my sound's okay, but stop me if my signal disappears.
Okay,
so thanks for the opportunity to talk, and for the organizers and for putting this webinar together. So my talk is quite short. It's only about 15 minutes. And I hope I don't get too difficult questions on the policy side, because that's not my expertise at all. So when I started looking at putting information together for this webinar, you can Google, and there's so much information out there. There's multiple documents, there's guidelines, there's books. And it was quite nice to hear from Heidi all the aspects of policy making, because I think we as researchers don't understand how complex it is. We don't understand all the layers that's involved. So it was wonderful hearing from her as well. But as I was putting stuff together, it made me think, if I was a postgraduate student or a young researcher, or even me myself as a less young researcher, this information is quite overwhelming. There's quite a lot of documents that tell you how to get your research out, what to do, what not to do. And then you start evaluating your research against all these documents that's available. And you ask yourself, do I actually ever contribute to policy or impact or not? And I think we can agree from a research perspective that some research remain in the lab. And it might be for the time being. And hopefully the research translates into policy, into social impact or change of policy, but some might not. And I think that's also okay. I think there's space for both of these. I think it is important to realize that we sometimes work on independent research questions that we have as scientists, and these do form part of a bigger story. And sometimes one don't realize that down the line, 5 years, 10 years down the line, the information you have generated as a scientist or as a researcher, or even as a postgraduate student, does have an impact on policy or society and on general knowledge out there. And it might not be immediate while you're doing your degree as a PhD student, and don't be discouraged if that is the case. We all know that as a single person, your impact on research, on knowledge generation, on improving human health, or whatever the case might be, is probably very minor. However, if you work in a group with a common goal, then these impacts are a lot more visible and easier to see. And while I was reading some of these documents, one thing that came across is the problem with sharing information, communication and collaboration between all these role players that are involved. And if communication is not there, again, the impact on your research is then limited. And I thought, with this talk, I have the opportunity maybe to illustrate via examples from South Africa, and specifically from a malaria vector control perspective, how some of the research can impact on policy change, improving human health, preventing mortality and death of people. So this is a long story, but let me start at the beginning and just give you a few. So these are classical maps of South Africa on your left-hand side. And so, and you can see that large parts of South Africa map of South Africa, where with malaria and vector control interventions, we can see free, and this means there's no local transmission. happening, but it does not mean that we don't have imported cases in these areas. The red pencil line that I quickly draw in is just the borders, what the 1938 map looked like. And you can see over the years, there's a huge reduction in malaria risk. And this is, of course, what we all aim for as scientists and as people. It doesn't matter whether you work as a health worker. At the end of the day, we are all aiming to reduce the burden of disease. So if we now zoom in quickly to malaria cases in South Africa from 1971 up till, say, 1995, you can see our average malaria cases are actually very low. It was seldom higher than 10,000 cases. And some of these increases were due to increased rainfall. There were increased surveillance activities during the time. There might have been also drug resistant in the parasite. But overall, it tells a good story. However, things change. And this map and this graph is no different. So if we now go and zoom in a little bit further, we can see that suddenly in 1995, there was a huge increase in malaria cases in South Africa. And then suddenly in 2001, you can see that these cases decrease significantly out of the blue. So I'm going to use this outbreak and the rapid response to these cases to illustrate how important it is to have research policy, government stakeholders, and all speaking to each other. This decrease, of course, are due to a change in policy on how control of malaria was done, and hence the outcome was spectacular. So as part of this graph, because entomology part and the mosquitoes was one of the major contributors to the rapid increase in malaria cases during this time. So I'm going to focus specifically on the vector side. But before I start, I want to take you back to 1994 when this story that I'm going to tell you about actually started. And some of the role players that I'll introduce during that time had no idea that we were going to have an outbreak 5 years later. But let me introduce the role players to you, because I think it's relevant to this webinar. And I've simplified the science, otherwise we'll be here for 5 hours. And I'm sure all of you want to go and have dinner if you're in the Central African time zone. But let's focus mainly on the communication and the sharing of data between stakeholders. So the first entity, if I can call them that, is postgraduate students that drive research in most countries, including South Africa. And students can have unrelated fields. So I just took students from, say, University of Pretoria, University of the Witwatersrand, and I'm affiliated to them. And you can have 2 students. And the one student, for example, started studies in 1995 and focused on systematics of the Phenestis group, for example. Another student focused on insecticide resistance. And these 2 studies on these 2 different postgraduate students had nothing to do with each other. Their projects were different, and they were supervised by different people. And it happens in most other universities as well. So, of course, students are dependent on supervisors. And in South Africa, in this example that I'm giving here, the supervisors were also based in a research institute that's affiliated with the university. And supervisors, of course, play an important role for postgraduate students. They initiate collaboration. And these collaborations can be international. It can be within the same continent. It can be within the African continent. And it doesn't matter where these collaborators are based, but they're actually very important for providing training. They build capacity, and overall, it's a good teaching and learning environment for postgraduate students. Supervisors on the other side are also able to identify gaps of knowledge within the country, within the field of research, supervisors need to think a bit bigger and a bit broader than sometimes us as postgraduate students might think. For example, in South Africa, because of control, IRS, we actually don't have the majority of the main malaria vector species. So here you have 2 students studying research on main malaria vectors, and one might ask, so why in South Africa do you want to study that? Well, the supervisors at that point thought the bigger question is, what happened if these species invade South Africa? Do we have the knowledge, do we have the capacity and the know-how to actually handle the situation? So in this scenario with research institutes, there's also a second level of collaboration that I think is very valuable to have. And this is with through the ministerial or government or vector control programs for this instance. And here you will have your field entomology teams. They work closely with the communities. And then you have a national level overseeing some of the provincial activities taking place. And of course, they also have international stakeholders like WHO that guide them. And you will see that all these blocks actually overlap. And that's a nice relationship to have, because the results coming from students, for example, and from research initiatives are then shared automatically with the national or provincial stakeholders. And in South Africa, we have a platform where we do this. The current platform is called the South African Malaria Elimination Committee, but over the past and in other countries, there are similar high-level meetings. And this platform actually allows for researchers and those that are important and actually doing the operational responsibility and malaria control in this case, to come together in one room. They talk to each other, they listen to each other, and it's a supportive collaboration between all these people involved, these stakeholders. This provides an opportunity to highlight challenges from both entities, both from a community level, where the control program is a lot more involved. They understand the community, they understand the challenges they have, and they can guide research as to what is needed, what are the problems they're facing, and then together, these entities can come up with solutions to actually have an impact. The operational automated system should necessarily dictate or limit the research being done by the universities, but nonetheless, it should be a cohesive symbiotic relation between these two entities. So now I'm going to take us back again to this outbreak in South Africa and how all these stakeholders played a role and made a difference in contributing individually to a pool of knowledge that was then used to actually impact on policy and resulted in this huge decline in malaria cases quite rapidly. And all the entities are interlinked. We cannot see them as single players sitting in a silo somewhere independent of each other. So if I go back to the postgraduate students that I illustrated a few slides back, that was trained via the university and the research institutes. During that time, the country developed tools to actually identify mosquito species on a molecular assay. So we could identify members of, say, the Phonestis group. And we also had the capacity to detect insecticide resistance via a separate postgraduate student project. And this, of course, further led to very high-tech molecular methods. And this is ongoing today, where we can actually detect mutations in mosquitoes. We know if they're resistant, and we know what these mechanisms actually look like. And there's millions of genes we can look at, and we feel really proud that we've achieved this. But all of this is still, at this point, in a lab setup. And with international collaborators that I showed on the slide, of course, the capacity was built. The postgraduate students now have knowledge that's available to share with other co-workers and other students within the team. So the control program, on the other hand, were the first to actually report an increase in malaria cases during this time. So in the malaria endemic provinces in South Africa, all the provinces have entomologists based in these provinces, and they provide valuable guidance when it comes to the control activities. They also monitor the action on the ground. They know normally what goes on in the sense of what happens in the community, cases, outbreaks, and so forth. But they don't necessarily, within the provincial level, have tools to monitor, like the insecticide-resistant mechanisms, for example. So field entomologists will then conduct surveillance, and they then reported that there were specific mosquitoes that they found indoors. And we know that the species of mosquitoes is more than 12 species, and they had no idea whether this mosquito was actually a vector or not. So does it transmit malaria or doesn't it? And this, from an operational point of view, was very important to them, because suddenly they found mosquitoes resting indoors that were sprayed with insecticide. At the time it was pyrethroids, and they had no idea, is the insecticides not working? Was there a problem with the procurement of the insecticides? Was it that the spraying was actually not done? So the control teams on the ground all have a leader that will sign off and sort of validate that structures were sprayed. So somewhere along the line, we knew there was a sort of a hiccup or a speed wobble in the system. And the last question was the mosquitoes actually resistant? And that's why suddenly they're not being killed by the insecticides. And the first sign was, of course, with the increase in malaria cases. That was the first warning sign that was available. And you can now sort of see how the story will come together. And each of these entities had a piece of the puzzle that had to come together. And that allowed us to see the full picture of what was going on and to understand what was happening, what caused the outbreak that was seen, and how we could use this knowledge to actually make a difference at the end. So we knew at that time to a bit of science. In 1996, we were able to identify species, and we didn't know that we're going to need these tools up until 1999, 2000, when we had an outbreak. But we then could identify these species. We know they were malaria vectors. We know they were infected with malaria parasite. And the control team could tell us they were local transmission. So with further studies, it was quite clear that these mosquitoes in South Africa had pyrethroid resistance and in themselves, and that's how come they survived and sat on the wall. So there was no control failure in the sense that the spray teams didn't do their job, or that there was some other hiccup. The procurement process were done well, the quality of the insecticides were good, and it all came down to the mosquito at that point. We were also able to identify the resistant mechanism. We knew how to counter or neutralize the resistance, and that was a key breakthrough also for private industry to get involved, to actually counteract the problem, if I can call it like that. And of course, this led to action. And as you can see, there was a huge decline again as soon as there was a change in policy. So the science were presented to stakeholders, and this had an influence, I think, and a policy at national level, at provincial level. And they acted very quickly. They could motivate. They had all the evidence that they could then present to the powers that be to actually make this change quite quickly. And although the scientists and the postgraduate students at the time in the lab didn't really know what the impact of their research was going to be, nor that they had the power or the know-how to actually implement these changes, having this communication between the groups, I think allowed for this rapid sort of action to be taken and to move forward. Okay. And that's why I think it's important, and it brings us down to the communication between all the role players. I think not one single scientist can underestimate the value of what they do, and they shouldn't try to work in a silo, because if you work in a silo, you're missing out getting your information out there, and you don't know who can actually use that information and who can find it useful, and how that can impact on either at a social level, within a community, or in a much bigger setup, like this case study I quickly sketched for you played a role. So just finally, I'd like to acknowledge people that provided the funding and support for, and were involved in the scenario that I've just sketched here. And that's me done. Thank you. Thanks, Oswald.
Okay, thank you very much, Lisette. It was very interesting story from the South African experience. And then I think it shows clearly how research output should be used for changing policy and then contribute to address a health problem in the community. So thank you very much, Lisette, for your talk. So we can just go around for a few questions maybe. And the first one that I have here is saying, how crucial is predictive research in guiding health-related decisions and actions, example in vaccine developments?
I think if you work in a specific field, it's very early on that you know you're going to have a problem. We know there's drug resistance in the parasite already. So scientists already know they should predict and come up with new ways to counter the problems that they're gonna envisage. We know that anti-malarial drug resistance were reported, I don't know, a few years ago, 5 maybe already. And although that drug resistance in the parasite haven't really spread throughout the continent, the scientists are already aware that there's a problem and they need to make a plan. So I think predicting where the research should lead is vital to get a step ahead to any of the challenges that you might have, in any discipline, not only in ours.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm not sure if you have some connection with industry, but this question is asking, is there disparity between university research and industry research and its impact on policy?
I think industry keeps a close eye on the research coming out of universities. I think industry also do their own research to guide. So I think it's also a symbiosis, because there's some skills and some research that can only be done by industry. And there are also only some research and sometimes blue sky research that initiate future work that can only be done at a university, because the mandate of both industry and universities are different. So I think complementary, they work together, although it sometimes doesn't, it's not quite obvious, I think, always to see. But I think the industry keeps their eye on what happens in the research. It also guides them where the challenges are, so they can also preempt solutions at the end of the day.
Okay, thanks. So once more, here it goes. Do certain type of funding determine the key voices in multidisciplinary research?
Yes, I think as researchers, we tend to go where we can get funding, because that's what we do. We look for funding and look for grants, and that guides to a big extent the type of research you do, where your research are going. But of course, your speciality or your expertise might limit you in what type of research you do. And that's where collaborations come in, because if you can then, as a researcher, identify, here's a funding opportunity and I can contribute a little bit in box A, and another collaborator can contribute a little bit in box B, and somebody else in box C, you have now a multidisciplinary team with expertise that we can all learn from, and that inevitably should go towards the postgraduate students, so they themselves can develop and have new skills that the supervisors might not all have in one little box. So yeah, where the funding is and what the funding agency identify as a niche is very important. But again, the funding agency, they keep their eyes open. They see where the need are. They listen to stakeholders. They listen to policymakers. And that also guides them what type of research should be funded based on the need from whether it's at the social impact study within the communities that they work in. So all of these things inevitably are linked with each other.
Okay, interesting. So I'm seeing a last question in the Q&A section. This is, how do we discourage competition in African research due to limited funding?
So I think competition is good, can be equally bad. There's always two sides of the coin. I think competition keeps us on our toes as scientists. You need to make sure that you're always up to speed with what's out there, what's needed. And I think also the competition in funding is good, because then sometimes you have people that can actually join hands and not compete with each other within the same pool of money. But that's how I think life is. There's little money. We all compete, but it's part of the fun at the end of the day.
Okay.
I think it's the same in all the disciplines, yeah, but it's not necessarily bad.
Yeah, I see. So our researcher, we don't have to be afraid of competition. Yeah, thank you.
Not at all. Yeah.
Okay. So I think that will be all for today. So thank you very much for your talk and your time, Lisette. So Victoria, any last words?
Yeah, thanks, Oswald. And Lisette, thank you. That was a really excellent talk and so interesting. Just before we go, I just would like to share one more slide. If you can see this. I just want to let everybody know our next webinar is going to be hosted by the American team, and we'll focus on marketing yourself for careers in academia and industry. This is going to be held in June or July, so follow us on our social media or join our mailing list to make sure you don't miss out. But thank you to everybody who joined tonight's webinar. It was really excellent. Unfortunately, Heidi's had to log off, so we're not going to continue with a roundtable discussion. I think we'll just leave the questions there for now. But Lisette, your talk was excellent, and thank you so much for joining and sharing all your knowledge.